Jessica hardly lived what seemed like the dream. As the owner of a successful marketing agency and married to Thomas, a charming entrepreneur with an infectious laugh, she often felt like the universe had blessed her with everything she could want. Their home was a modern architectural masterpiece nestled in the heart of an upscale suburb, its walls adorned with memories of travels and achievements. Friends admired their dynamic partnership, often calling them the power couple. Jessica took pride in the life they had built together, believing their bond was rooted in trust, respect, and an unwavering love. As she prepared breakfast one sunny morning, she smiled at the sound of Thomas's footsteps descending the stairs. His kiss on her cheek felt like reassurance, a silent promise of their shared future. Yet, as she drove to work that morning, a faint but persistent unease crept into her thoughts. Life was good, almost too good, she reflected. Jessica wasn't one to dwell on paranoia, but she had noticed subtle shifts lately. Thomas had been busier than usual, often missing their nightly ritual of winding down together with wine and stories from their day. It's just a phase, she muttered to herself, shaking off her doubts. Little did she know, this perfect image of her life would soon shatter. Beneath the carefully curated facade of their marriage lay secrets, ones that would uproot everything she believed in. For now, however, she allowed herself to believe in the illusion, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing on her horizon. The signs were faint at first. Jessica began noticing that Thomas spent less time at home, claiming long hours at work and urgent meetings. While his charismatic demeanor reassured her, it couldn't erase the flickers of doubt that had started to surface. On one particular evening, Jessica had prepared a special dinner to celebrate an important contract she had secured at work. She eagerly waited for Thomas, only to receive a curt text, "Working late. Don't wait up." She laughed nervously, telling herself it was just his commitment to his job. Still, the untouched plates of her carefully prepared meal felt like silent witnesses to her growing loneliness. The late nights became frequent, and Thomas's phone was always either in his hand or locked away. Jessica, who had always trusted him implicitly, began to feel uneasy. One night, as they lay in bed, she noticed him scrolling through his phone, his body angled away from her. "What's keeping you up?" she asked, her voice light but tinged with curiosity. "Just work emails," he replied quickly, slipping the phone under his pillow. Jessica's stomach twisted, but she pushed the feeling aside. She convinced herself it was her imagination, her stress from work manifesting as paranoia. She didn't want to be the clingy wife, the one who overanalyzed every action. But deep down, a voice whispered, urging her to pay closer attention. Something had shifted, and Jessica could no longer ignore the growing chasm between them. It was a rainy afternoon when Jessica's world began to crumble. The sound of raindrops against the window mirrored her internal unease as she sorted through the pile of unopened mail on Thomas's desk. She wasn't snooping, at least, that's what she told herself. Yet, when her fingers brushed against a folder labeled confidential, her heart skipped a beat. She hesitated, but a gnawing curiosity pushed her to open it. Inside, she found something that made her blood run cold, legal documents transferring the deeds to her properties into Thomas's name. Her name was forged in bold ink, the signatures too perfect to be genuine. Her hands trembled as she read through the papers, disbelief clouding her thoughts. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. But then she found more, receipts for expensive gifts she had never received and bookings for a 5-star hotel under Thomas's name. The most damning evidence? The guest list included another woman's name. Jessica's breath hitched, her vision blurring with tears. The man she had trusted with her life, the man who promised to cherish her forever, had betrayed her in the most profound ways. Sitting alone in the dim light of the study, Jessica felt her heart break into pieces. But as the pain consumed her, it was joined by a rising tide of anger. Thomas hadn't just broken her trust, he had tried to rob her of everything she had worked for. And Jessica wasn't about to let him win. That evening, Jessica sat in the dining room, her heart pounding as she waited for Thomas to return. The damning evidence lay on the table, each piece meticulously arranged like a puzzle that painted a horrifying picture. When Thomas walked through the door, his usual carefree expression faltered as his eyes fell on the documents. Jessica, he began, his voice laced with caution, what's all this? Jessica's hands clenched into fists under the table as she steadied her voice. Why don't you tell me, Thomas, she asked, her tone icy. For a moment, he hesitated, his charming facade slipping. But then he laughed, a hollow, cruel sound that made Jessica's stomach turn. You weren't supposed to find out like this, he said, his words dripping with arrogance. He didn't deny the affair, nor did he try to explain away the fraud. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, smirking as he revealed his plans to divorce her and take everything she owned. You were too trusting, he said, his voice cold. Jessica felt her world tilt, but she refused to let him see her crumble. Her voice broke as she stood her ground, declaring, You'll regret underestimating me, Thomas. Though her heart was shattered, her resolve was unyielding. The fight for her life, her dignity, had begun. Jessica didn't have to face the storm alone. Rachel, her best friend since college, arrived at her house the next day after hearing about the confrontation. Rachel was the kind of friend who never minced words, and Jessica knew she could count on her for brutal honesty and unwavering support. Over steaming mugs of coffee, Jessica poured out every detail, the documents, the affair, and Thomas's audacious confession. Rachel listened in stunned silence, her face alternating between disbelief and fury. That bastard, Rachel finally spat out, slamming her cup on the table. You need to act, Jess. Fast. He's more dangerous than you think. Rachel's warning wasn't just about emotional betrayal, it was a practical wake-up call. She explained how people like Thomas, driven by greed and entitlement, often played a long game, eroding their victims' defenses before delivering the final blow. Do you remember what happened to my cousin Sarah? Rachel asked. Jessica nodded vaguely, recalling the story of a manipulative husband who had left Sarah penniless and broken. Don't let him do that to you, Rachel continued, her voice firm. You have resources, Jess, friends, lawyers. Use them. Don't let him walk all over you. Jessica's eyes filled with tears, but Rachel grabbed her hands, steadying her. You're stronger than this. You've built an empire, and you won't let some conman tear it down. Rachel's words reignited a spark in Jessica, reminding her that she wasn't powerless. There was a battle ahead, and she wasn't going to back down. That evening, Jessica made a call she had been avoiding for days. Her mother, Eleanor, was a strong, no-nonsense woman who had always been Jessica's guiding force. Though their relationship had its ups and downs, Jessica knew Eleanor would offer her clarity in this moment of chaos. When Eleanor answered the phone, her voice was calm but concerned. Jessica? What's wrong, darling? Jessica hesitated before pouring out the entire story, her voice trembling as she recounted Thomas's betrayal. On the other end of the line, Eleanor listened patiently, letting her daughter vent without interruption. When Jessica finished, Eleanor's response was not one of shock but quiet reassurance. I always suspected Thomas wasn't as perfect as he seemed, she admitted. Jessica frowned, caught off guard. Why didn't you say anything? Eleanor sighed. Because you were in love, and I wanted you to learn your own lessons. But I didn't leave you unprotected, sweetheart. Do you remember when we set up your company's legal structure? Jessica nodded slowly. Eleanor continued, we agreed back then to keep the property deeds under my name, just in case. Thomas can't touch what isn't legally yours. Jessica felt a wave of relief crash over her. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. Eleanor's foresight had saved her from complete ruin. You're going to be fine, her mother said with quiet confidence. You're smarter than he is, and you're going to show him that. But first, you need to fight. Jessica hung up, her resolve stronger than ever. The next morning, Jessica sat in the plush office of her lawyer, Alan Grant. Alan had been her legal advisor for years, and he had always been thorough and methodical. As Jessica explained the situation, Alan listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. Jessica, this is going to be messy, he began. But the good news is, you're in a better position than most. Your mother's decision to keep the assets under her name is a game changer. Alan laid out a plan that was as strategic as it was aggressive. They would focus on gathering solid evidence of Thomas's fraud and infidelity, building an airtight case to counter any claims he might make. The key here is to stay composed, Alan advised. Thomas will try to provoke you, paint you as the villain. Don't give him that power. He also emphasized the importance of public perception, warning that Thomas's charm could sway opinions if she wasn't careful. Jessica listened, her determination hardening with every word. She refused to let Thomas win, but she also knew this wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming her life and protecting what she had worked so hard to build. As she left Alan's office, Jessica felt a sense of purpose. She wasn't just preparing for a fight, she was preparing for victory. Jessica woke up to chaos. Her phone buzzed incessantly with calls, texts, and notifications. When she opened one message from Rachel, her heart sank. It was a link to a viral post on social media. Thomas had gone public, announcing their divorce in a statement riddled with lies and insinuations. The post painted Jessica as an unfaithful, greedy wife who had taken advantage of his trust and generosity. To add insult to injury, he included photos of himself looking distraught, strategically playing the victim. The media latched onto the story instantly. Headlines screamed about the downfall of the power couple, with tabloids embellishing Thomas's narrative. Jessica's name was dragged through the mud, her reputation tarnished overnight. As she scrolled through the hateful comments, Jessica felt a pang of betrayal that cut deeper than she thought possible. People who once admired her success now questioned her integrity. But amid the anger and hurt, a simmering determination began to take root. She realized this was Thomas's attempt to control the narrative, to paint her as the villain before she could expose his lies. Rachel arrived at her house later that day, armed with coffee and a fierce look of resolve. "Let them talk," Rachel said firmly. "The truth always comes out." Jessica nodded, knowing her friend was right. But the sting of public judgment still weighed heavily on her. She decided then and there that she wouldn't defend herself with words. She would let her actions, and the undeniable evidence, speak louder than any gossip ever could. Jessica threw herself into action, her grief and anger channeling into a laser-sharp focus. Together with Alan and Rachel, she began piecing together a trail of evidence that would expose Thomas for who he truly was. The work was grueling, but Jessica was relentless. She combed through financial records, emails, and personal accounts, uncovering a web of deceit that stretched further than she had imagined. Thomas hadn't just betrayed her, he had orchestrated a calculated plan to strip her of everything she owned. Late one night, Jessica found herself staring at an old photo of them together, taken during their honeymoon. The love she once saw in his eyes now seemed like a cruel illusion. She wondered how long he had been planning his betrayal. Had it been years? Months? The thought made her chest ache, but she pushed it aside. This wasn't the time for tears. Every new piece of evidence felt like a step closer to reclaiming her life. Among the discoveries was an email thread that revealed Thomas's liaison with his mistress, a woman named Vanessa. Vanessa wasn't just a lover, she was an accomplice in his schemes. Jessica shared the findings with Alan, who couldn't hide his satisfaction. "This is gold," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "When we present this in court, his credibility will crumble." Jessica nodded, but her face remained stoic. She wasn't celebrating yet. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. The days that followed were a test of Jessica's resilience. As the media continued to vilify her, she refused to engage. Her silence was misinterpreted as guilt, but Jessica didn't care. She had learned from Alan and Rachel that patience was her greatest weapon. Public perception could be fickle, but the truth was immutable. She focused on preparing for the courtroom battle ahead, pouring all her energy into ensuring her case was airtight. Jessica also began to transform her pain into something more powerful, determination. She worked out every morning, finding strength in physical discipline. Therapy sessions with her psychologist helped her process the emotional wounds, giving her clarity and focus. Slowly, she began to rebuild the confidence Thomas had tried to strip away. Rachel often reminded her, "You're not just fighting for your reputation, you're fighting for your future." And Jessica took those words to heart. One evening, Jessica stood on the balcony of her home, gazing out at the city lights. The house that once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a battlefield, every corner tainted by memories of Thomas's betrayal. But instead of despair, she felt an unshakable resolve. "This is just the beginning," she whispered to herself. Jessica wasn't the same woman she had been weeks ago. The heartbreak had hardened her, but it had also transformed her into someone stronger, someone ready to face whatever came next. The courtroom was packed with onlookers, reporters, and legal professionals eager to witness the high-profile divorce case of Jessica Hart. The air buzzed with anticipation as Thomas's legal team arrived, armed with a stack of documents they claimed would prove their client's innocence and Jessica's alleged wrongdoings. Jessica, dressed in a simple yet elegant navy blue suit, sat silently beside Alan, her lawyer. Her composure was unshaken, even as whispers and cameras surrounded her. She had prepared for this moment, knowing the stakes were high. This wasn't just about money or reputation, it was about her future. Thomas's lawyer, an ambitious and arrogant man named Victor Kane, began with a theatrical opening statement. He painted Thomas as a victim of Jessica's supposed greed and manipulation, a man who had been unfairly cast aside after years of devotion. Victor presented forged documents and fabricated testimonies, attempting to establish that Thomas had equal claim to the properties in question. Jessica clenched her fists beneath the table, her heart pounding as Victor skillfully wove a web of lies. But Alan had warned her not to react, not yet. The judge, a stern woman named Evelyn Monroe, listened intently, her expression unreadable. When it was Alan's turn to speak, he chose his words carefully, knowing the first impression was critical. "Your Honor, we will prove that the claims made by Mr. Thomas Hart are not only baseless but are part of a calculated scheme to defraud my client. The evidence we present will leave no doubt about his true intentions." The trial had begun, and the tension in the room was palpable. The second day of the trial brought an unexpected twist, one that Thomas and his legal team had not anticipated. Alan stood before the court with an air of quiet confidence, holding a set of documents that would turn the tide in Jessica's favor. "Your Honor," he began, addressing Judge Monroe, "while Mr. Hart's legal team has argued for his entitlement to the properties in question, I must emphasize one critical fact. These properties were never under my client's name." Alan explained how the properties were legally owned by Jessica's mother, Eleanor, and had been since their acquisition. This arrangement was not a secretive or deceptive act but a strategic measure to protect Jessica's hard-earned assets, he continued. Alan handed over the original deeds, complete with Eleanor's signature, to Judge Monroe. The courtroom fell silent as the realization dawned. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier smugness replaced by visible unease. Jessica watched him closely, noting the flicker of fear in his eyes. For the first time, she felt the balance of power shift in her favor. Thomas's legal team scrambled to counter the revelation, but the damage was done. This was the first crack in Thomas's carefully constructed facade, and it would only grow larger as the trial progressed. Jessica's secret weapon, her mother's foresight, had struck a devastating blow. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, and Jessica allowed herself a small, private smile. The truth was beginning to emerge. Jessica's legal team escalated their attack on the third day of the trial. Alan and his team meticulously presented evidence that painted an undeniable picture of Thomas's fraudulent activities. Bank statements, emails, and digital trails revealed his attempts to forge Jessica's signatures and transfer funds without her knowledge. Every piece of evidence was cross-verified, leaving no room for doubt. Alan introduced a forensic handwriting expert who testified that Thomas had not only falsified Jessica's signature on key documents, but had done so with intent to deceive. The expert's testimony was damning, as she explained how subtle inconsistencies in the signatures proved they were forgeries. Jessica watched as Thomas's face turned pale, his confidence evaporating with every word spoken against him. But the most explosive moment came when Alan played a recording of a conversation between Thomas and his mistress, Vanessa. In the recording, Thomas boasted about his plan to take everything from Jessica, referring to her as too trusting to see it coming. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Jessica felt a wave of both pain and satisfaction as the words echoed through the room. The man she had once loved was now exposed as a manipulative liar. By the end of the day, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted entirely. Thomas's legal team looked visibly rattled, while Jessica's team stood firm. The evidence was irrefutable, and for the first time, the scales of justice tipped unmistakably in Jessica's favor. As the trial continued, the media began to shift their narrative. Journalists who had initially portrayed Jessica as the villain now uncovered the depth of Thomas's deceit. Headlines went from Jessica Hart's fall from grace to the truth behind Thomas Hart's betrayal. Public opinion, once against her, started to lean in her favor as more details from the trial emerged. Jessica, however, remained focused on the trial. She had no interest in public vindication. Her goal was justice. Nevertheless, she couldn't ignore the flood of support pouring in from strangers online. Messages of encouragement, apologies for prior judgment, and stories from women who had faced similar betrayals filled her inbox. It was overwhelming but also deeply moving. Jessica realized her fight wasn't just for herself, it was for every person who had been deceived, manipulated, or silenced. Meanwhile, Thomas struggled to maintain his public image. His calculated charm began to falter as the media dug deeper into his past, uncovering a history of manipulative behavior. Vanessa, his mistress, became a focus of scandal as well, adding to the growing public disdain for Thomas. The tables had turned, and for the first time, Jessica felt the weight of societal judgment lifting from her shoulders. She wasn't just reclaiming her life, she was reclaiming her story. The final day of the trial arrived with an air of anticipation so thick that it was almost suffocating. Jessica sat calmly at her table, her confidence no longer an act but a quiet, steady force. Alan stood to deliver his closing argument, the culmination of weeks of meticulous planning and undeniable evidence. Your Honor, Thomas Hart's actions were not those of a loving husband, but of a calculated manipulator, he began, his voice firm and resonant. Not only did he violate the trust of his wife, but he also sought to strip her of everything she worked tirelessly to build. Alan didn't stop there. He argued that Thomas's fraudulent actions had caused significant emotional and financial harm to Jessica, warranting reparations beyond a simple dismissal of his claims. Given the extent of his deceit, it is only fair that my client receives her rightful share of the assets Mr. Hart still holds, he declared. Jessica glanced at Thomas, whose face was a mask of barely concealed panic. His legal team whispered furiously among themselves, knowing the argument had landed a powerful blow. When Judge Monroe delivered the verdict, her voice was measured but firm. It is the court's decision that all claims made by Mr. Thomas Hart are invalid due to overwhelming evidence of fraud. Furthermore, given the egregious nature of Mr. Hart's actions, this court awards Mrs. Jessica Hart 50% of Mr. Hart's remaining assets. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Thomas looked as though the ground had been pulled out from under him. Jessica sat motionless for a moment, letting the weight of the victory settle over her. Then, for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. The aftermath of the trial was a whirlwind of consequences for Thomas. Stripped of his reputation, his assets, and his public sympathy, he quickly found himself in a downward spiral. He was forced to vacate their shared home, a place he had once flaunted as a symbol of his success. The house was sold to cover his mounting legal fees, leaving him with little more than a suitcase of belongings and the sharp sting of humiliation. Jessica, now back in her mother's home, watched the events unfold from a distance. Despite her anger and pain, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of pity as she saw photos of Thomas in the tabloids, looking disheveled and defeated. Public opinion had turned entirely against him, and his once loyal friends and business associates abandoned him. Vanessa, too, disappeared from his life, unwilling to weather the storm of scandal and financial ruin. Thomas tried to salvage what was left of his life, but his attempts were met with failure after failure. Job offers dried up, and his name became synonymous with greed and betrayal. At night, he drank himself into oblivion, haunted by the memories of his former life. Jessica, on the other hand, found herself moving forward. She didn't revel in Thomas's downfall, but she couldn't deny the sense of justice in seeing him face the consequences of his actions. It was a harsh but necessary reckoning, one that marked the beginning of a new chapter for them both. Jessica sat alone in her favorite chair, gazing out at the garden where her mother's flowers bloomed in vibrant hues. The legal battle was over, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace. It wasn't just a verdict that brought her solace, it was the realization that she had reclaimed her power. Thomas had tried to strip her of everything, but he hadn't succeeded. In fact, his betrayal had only made her stronger. Her thoughts drifted to the trial and the moments when she had wanted to crumble under the weight of it all. But she hadn't. She had faced every challenge with resilience and grace, and now she was reaping the rewards of her perseverance. The media had dubbed her a symbol of empowerment, and while Jessica was grateful for the recognition, she knew her journey wasn't about public validation. It was about finding herself again, piece by piece. Rachel arrived later that evening with a bottle of champagne. "To you," she said, raising her glass, "and to the next chapter of your life." Jessica smiled, clinking glasses with her best friend. "To new beginnings," she replied. As they sat together, laughing and reminiscing, Jessica felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just happiness, it was hope. She had walked through fire and emerged stronger, and now the future felt brighter than ever. Jessica's story became a sensation overnight. News outlets, blogs, and social media platforms buzzed with discussions about her triumph in court. From betrayal to victory, Jessica Hart's inspiring journey read one headline, accompanied by a photo of her walking out of the courthouse with her head held high. Women across the country flooded her inbox with messages of admiration, sharing their own stories of resilience and thanking her for being a source of inspiration. Jessica was initially overwhelmed by the attention. She had never sought the spotlight, and the sudden influx of interviews and appearances felt foreign to her. But as she read the heartfelt messages from strangers, she realized the importance of her story. By sharing her experience, she wasn't just healing herself, she was helping others find their strength. She decided to use her newfound platform to advocate for women's empowerment, speaking at events and partnering with organizations dedicated to supporting survivors of abuse and betrayal. The media frenzy also brought unexpected opportunities. Publishers reached out, offering book deals for her to tell her story in her own words. Jessica hesitated at first, unsure if she wanted to relive the painful memories. But Rachel reminded her, "This is your chance to take control of the narrative. To show the world who you really are." With that encouragement, Jessica agreed to write a memoir, pouring her heart into every page. It became a bestseller, cementing her place as a voice of resilience and hope. Destitute and broken, Thomas reached out to Jessica in a last-ditch attempt to salvage something from his shattered life. He called her one evening, his voice trembling with desperation. "Jessica, please," he begged, "I've lost everything. I don't have anyone left. Can we meet? Just for a moment?" Jessica listened silently, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. This was the man she had once loved, the man she had built a life with. But he was also the man who had betrayed her in the most unforgivable ways. Against her better judgment, she agreed to meet him in a public cafe. When she arrived, she barely recognized him. His once pristine appearance was replaced by disheveled hair, hollow cheeks, and a defeated posture. He looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes and began to plead. "I made mistakes," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I let greed and arrogance blind me, and now I have nothing. Please, Jessica. Help me." Jessica took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Thomas," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I'm sorry for what you're going through. But you made your choices, and now you're facing the consequences. I can't save you." As she stood to leave, Thomas grabbed her hand, his grip weak but desperate. "Please," he whispered. Jessica pulled away, her resolve unshaken. "Goodbye, Thomas," she said, walking out without looking back. Jessica returned home that evening with a sense of finality she hadn't felt before. Meeting Thomas had been difficult, but it had also been necessary. For years, she had carried the weight of his betrayal, the pain of losing the man she thought she knew. But now, she felt that weight lift. Forgiving Thomas wasn't possible, but she could forgive herself, for trusting him, for loving him, and for staying blind to the red flags. As she sat in her living room, sipping tea, Jessica thought about the life she wanted to build. She no longer needed closure from Thomas, she had found it within herself. The door to her past was finally closed, and she was ready to move forward. For the first time in a long while, Jessica felt truly free. After the whirlwind of the courtroom drama and the media frenzy that followed, Jessica knew she needed time to rediscover herself away from the chaos. She packed her belongings and moved to a quaint countryside home surrounded by rolling hills and tranquil meadows. The house was modest, a stark contrast to the grandeur she had shared with Thomas, but it radiated warmth and peace. Each morning, she would wake to the sound of birdsong and the sight of sunlight filtering through the trees. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of expectations and appearances begin to dissolve. In the quiet of her retreat, Jessica allowed herself to reflect on the tumultuous events of the past year. She spent her days walking through the fields, reading books she had long neglected, and journaling her thoughts. The simplicity of the countryside was a balm to her weary soul, providing her the solitude she needed to heal. As the days turned into weeks, Jessica realized she didn't miss the fast-paced life she had left behind. Instead, she found solace in the rhythm of nature, where life continued to flourish despite the storms. This retreat wasn't just an escape, it was the beginning of her journey towards self-discovery and renewal. In the serenity of her new home, Jessica found herself revisiting the memories of her marriage, not with bitterness but with a newfound clarity. She began to see the red flags she had ignored, the dismissive comments, the growing emotional distance, the excuses she made for Thomas's increasingly selfish behavior. She realized how much of herself she had sacrificed to maintain the illusion of a perfect marriage. Those moments of self-denial came rushing back, each memory a reminder of how she had slowly silenced her own needs for the sake of someone who never truly valued her. Jessica didn't allow herself to dwell in regret, but instead used these reflections to understand her patterns and choices. She started writing letters to her younger self, offering the wisdom she had gained through her trials. Each letter was a cathartic release, a way to forgive herself for the mistakes she had made and the pain she had endured. These letters became her guideposts, helping her navigate the complex process of letting go. Slowly, she began to reclaim the pieces of herself she had lost, not by erasing the past, but by accepting it as a part of her story. Seeking professional help was a decision Jessica had hesitated over, but when she finally began therapy, it became a lifeline. Her therapist, a compassionate yet firm woman named Dr. Alana Pierce, provided a safe space for Jessica to unpack years of emotional abuse and self-doubt. In their sessions, Jessica confronted the deep-seated fears that had kept her tethered to a toxic relationship for so long. They talked about the guilt she carried, the shame she felt for not recognizing Thomas's deceit earlier, and the exhaustion of constantly putting others before herself. Over time, Jessica began to see herself through a different lens. Therapy taught her that her worth wasn't tied to her past mistakes or the opinions of others. She started practicing small acts of self-care, like setting boundaries, saying no without guilt, and celebrating her own achievements. These steps, though small, felt monumental. With each breakthrough, Jessica's confidence grew, and she began to trust her intuition again. She realized she wasn't broken, she was healing, and that process was a testament to her resilience. One day, while cleaning out a forgotten closet in her new home, Jessica stumbled upon an old wooden box filled with art supplies. The sight of the worn paintbrushes and half-used tubes of oil paint sparked a memory of the joy she had once found in painting. It had been years since she had touched a canvas, her passion for art buried beneath the demands of her career and marriage. Tentatively, she set up a small easel by the window, letting the sunlight pour over her workspace, and began to paint. At first, her strokes were hesitant, the images on the canvas fragmented and incomplete. But as she let go of her need for perfection, her creativity began to flow. Painting became her sanctuary, a place where she could express the emotions she struggled to put into words. Each brushstroke felt like a piece of her soul coming alive again. Over time, her work evolved from abstract shapes to vivid landscapes and portraits, capturing the beauty and complexity of her journey. Art didn't just heal her, it reignited a part of her she thought she had lost forever. Jessica's quiet life took an unexpected turn when she met Daniel, her neighbor from the farmhouse across the hill. Their introduction was as simple as it was serendipitous. One evening, as Jessica struggled to fix the latch on her garden gate, Daniel appeared with a toolbox in hand. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice warm and friendly. Though hesitant at first, Jessica accepted his assistance, and their conversation flowed effortlessly. Daniel shared stories of his own struggles, including the loss of his wife years ago, and Jessica found his honesty refreshing. Over time, their paths began to cross more frequently, whether it was during her morning walks or his trips to the local market. Daniel had a quiet strength about him, a steadiness that Jessica found comforting. He never pried into her past, but offered companionship and understanding whenever she was ready to share. Their budding friendship became a source of light in Jessica's life, a reminder that connections could still be meaningful and pure. Despite her growing bond with Daniel, Jessica found herself grappling with fears she couldn't easily shake. Every kind gesture, every word of encouragement, seemed to trigger a wave of doubt. Was he too good to be true? Could she trust him not to betray her, as Thomas had? These questions loomed over her like shadows, threatening to undermine the progress she had made. She discussed these fears with Dr. Pierce, who gently guided her toward understanding that her hesitancy was a natural response to trauma. Jessica began to practice vulnerability in small steps, sharing fragments of her story with Daniel. His response was always the same, gentle, patient, and devoid of judgment. "I know what it's like to carry pain," he told her one evening. "But I also know it's possible to heal." Slowly, Jessica's walls began to lower, not because Daniel demanded it, but because she chose to trust herself again. Trusting him became an act of faith, not in him but in her own strength to face whatever the future held. Reinvigorated by her personal growth, Jessica decided it was time to return to her career. But this time, she approached her work with a renewed sense of purpose. Inspired by her journey, she launched a project focused on empowering women through mentorship and financial education. She believed that knowledge was a powerful tool, one that could prevent others from falling victim to the kind of betrayal she had experienced. The project quickly gained traction, drawing support from organizations and individuals who admired Jessica's resilience. She poured her heart into every detail, from designing workshops to creating a network of resources for women in need. Her efforts were recognized nationally, earning her accolades she never could have imagined. But for Jessica, the true reward wasn't the recognition, it was the knowledge that she was making a difference. Her career was no longer just about personal success, it had become a platform for change. Despite her accomplishments, Jessica still faced scrutiny from those who clung to the rumors Thomas had spread during their divorce. Whispered judgments and skeptical glances followed her at public events, but Jessica refused to let them define her. She had learned that the opinions of others held no power over her unless she allowed them to. With each public appearance, she stood taller, exuding a quiet confidence that silenced her critics. Her ability to rise above the negativity inspired those who had been watching her journey. Women approached her, not just for advice, but to thank her for showing them what strength looked like. Jessica's story wasn't about revenge or vindication, it was about resilience and the power of self-belief. Standing tall wasn't just a choice, it was a declaration of her worth and an example for others to follow. Jessica's journey toward trust was a slow but deliberate process, and letting Daniel into her life required immense courage. For weeks, she had wrestled with her emotions, uncertain whether to reveal the depths of her pain and fears to someone new. But Daniel's patience and unwavering kindness gradually chipped away at the walls she had built. One quiet evening, as they sat on the porch overlooking the rolling hills, Jessica began to share pieces of her story. She spoke about the betrayal, the courtroom battles, and the struggle to rebuild her life. Her voice trembled at first, but Daniel listened without interruption, his gentle presence giving her the reassurance she needed. As Jessica shared her dreams for the future, dreams of freedom, purpose, and love, she noticed how Daniel responded with admiration rather than judgment. He encouraged her to see her strength and resilience, qualities she had long underestimated in herself. Their conversations became deeper and more frequent, creating a bond built on honesty and mutual respect. For the first time in years, Jessica felt seen and valued for who she truly was, not for the roles she played or the scars she carried. Opening up to Daniel was not just about trusting him, it was about reclaiming her ability to connect with others and allowing herself to hope for something new. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Jessica and Daniel walked through the woods near her home, their friendship took a transformative turn. They stopped by a clearing where the golden sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow over the landscape. Daniel took her hands in his and, with a sincerity that left her breathless, confessed how deeply he cared for her. He spoke of her courage, her kindness, and the way she inspired him to face his own fears. His words were not rushed or dramatic but heartfelt, carrying a weight that resonated with her own guarded heart. In that moment, Jessica realized she had already started to fall for him. The scars from her past no longer felt like barriers but stepping stones to something beautiful. She didn't respond with grand declarations or promises. Instead, she leaned into the simplicity of the moment, allowing herself to feel the safety and warmth of Daniel's affection. Their shared laughter, their unspoken understanding, and their mutual respect became the foundation of a relationship that felt profoundly different from anything she had known before. This was not the beginning of a love story shaped by illusions, it was the beginning of one rooted in truth and trust. Meanwhile, Thomas's life had taken a steep and irreversible decline. Once a man who thrived on deceit and manipulation, he now found himself homeless and destitute. The wealth and power he had sought to secure through betrayal had slipped through his fingers, leaving him with nothing but regret. Passers-by in the city barely recognized him, his tailored suits replaced by tattered clothing and his once confident demeanor reduced to a desperate shell of its former self. The few people who stopped to acknowledge him offered only fleeting sympathy, having heard the stories of his treachery. Thomas had become a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of what unchecked greed and dishonesty could lead to. He often spent his days reflecting on the choices that had brought him to this point. The grandeur he once coveted now felt meaningless in the face of his loneliness and suffering. Though he occasionally dreamed of rebuilding his life, his shame and self-loathing weighed him down. It was a humbling existence, one that forced him to confront the emptiness of the path he had chosen. One rainy afternoon, as Jessica walked through the bustling streets of the city, she unexpectedly crossed paths with Thomas. He sat on the sidewalk, his head bowed and his hands clutching a small cardboard sign that read "Help Needed." His once proud face was gaunt and withered, and his eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a mixture of recognition and despair. For a moment, Jessica felt a pang of pity, not for the man who had betrayed her, but for the broken person he had become. Thomas begged for her forgiveness, his voice cracking as he recounted the hardships he had faced since their divorce. He pleaded for another chance, insisting that he had changed. But Jessica, having found peace and strength in her own journey, knew that his redemption was not her responsibility. She offered him no harsh words or reproach. Instead, she calmly told him, "I hope you find the strength to rebuild your life." Then, she walked away, leaving behind the burden of anger and bitterness that had once consumed her. Daniel's proposal to Jessica was not elaborate or staged, but deeply personal and heartfelt. One evening, as they shared a quiet dinner at her countryside home, he reached into his pocket and revealed a small velvet box. "Jessica," he began, his voice steady yet filled with emotion, "I've watched you face unimaginable challenges with grace and courage. You've shown me what true strength looks like, and I can't imagine my life without you." He opened the box to reveal a simple yet elegant ring, a symbol of his love and respect. Jessica was taken aback, her emotions a whirlwind of joy and apprehension. She hesitated, not because she doubted his love, but because she wanted to ensure that this decision was made with her whole heart. After a moment of silence, she looked into Daniel's eyes and saw nothing but sincerity. "Yes," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper but filled with conviction. It was a moment of triumph, not just for their relationship but for Jessica's journey toward reclaiming her happiness. Planning the wedding became a collaborative and joyful experience for Jessica. Unlike the grand spectacle of her first marriage, she wanted this ceremony to reflect simplicity, authenticity, and love. With her mother and close friends by her side, she selected every detail with care, from the wildflowers that would adorn the venue to the handwritten invitations that carried a personal touch. Each decision was a celebration of the people who had supported her through her darkest days. As the preparations progressed, Jessica found herself filled with a sense of gratitude. The process wasn't just about the wedding, it was about creating new memories that honored the person she had become. Her friends and family marveled at her transformation, noting the confidence and joy that now radiated from her. For Jessica, this wedding was not just a union with Daniel, it was a symbol of her resilience and a testament to the power of healing and love. The night before her wedding, Jessica found herself unable to sleep. She sat by the window of her bedroom, the moonlight casting a silvery glow over her childhood diary. Opening its worn pages, she revisited entries from years ago, written by a younger version of herself, someone full of dreams but unaware of the trials life would bring. The Jessica from those pages had been optimistic and trusting, willing to give her heart entirely to a man who would later betray her. Tears welled in her eyes as she confronted those memories, not with anger but with a bittersweet longing for the innocence she had lost. Determined to close this chapter of her life, Jessica penned a letter to her younger self. In it, she forgave herself for ignoring the red flags and for staying in a relationship that drained her spirit. She wrote about the strength she had discovered and the lessons she had learned. By the time she finished, the weight she had carried for so long felt lighter. Folding the letter, she tucked it between the pages of her diary, a symbolic gesture of closure. Jessica knew that her wedding day would not just be about beginning a new life with Daniel, it would also mark her liberation from the pain of her past. The day of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the countryside bathed in golden sunlight. Jessica stood in her simple yet elegant dress, her hair adorned with a delicate crown of wildflowers. Her mother adjusted the hem of the gown, her eyes glistening with pride. As Jessica walked toward the small gathering of loved ones, her heart swelled with gratitude. This ceremony, intimate and free of pretense, was everything she had hoped for, a celebration of love, resilience, and renewal. When she reached Daniel at the altar, his eyes met hers with a look of unwavering devotion. The officiant began the ceremony, but Jessica found herself focused on the emotions coursing through her. As they exchanged vows, she spoke not only to Daniel but also to the part of herself that had doubted whether she would ever find happiness again. With every word, she let go of the fear and pain that had haunted her. When Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, it felt like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. The applause of their family and friends was a distant hum compared to the joy that resonated in her heart. After the wedding, Jessica and Daniel began the process of blending their lives. Their shared home, a modest but welcoming cottage in the countryside, became a sanctuary filled with laughter and understanding. They brought their own traditions and habits into this new chapter, finding joy in the little things, cooking dinner together, planting flowers in the garden, and taking long evening walks. The ease with which they connected reassured Jessica that she had made the right choice. Over time, Jessica noticed the profound impact Daniel had on her sense of self. He didn't try to erase her scars or pretend they didn't exist. Instead, he celebrated the strength they represented. In return, she supported him through his own struggles, offering him the same patience and empathy he had shown her. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was built on a foundation of mutual respect and authenticity. Together, they created a life that felt rich in love and purpose, a stark contrast to the emptiness Jessica had once endured. One quiet evening, Jessica sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. As she sipped her tea, she reflected on how far she had come. Her journey had been marked by betrayal, heartbreak, and uncertainty, but it had also been a story of resilience, healing, and rediscovery. The woman she had become was far removed from the one who had once doubted her worth. She was stronger, wiser, and more attuned to her needs and desires. Jessica thought about the people who had supported her, her mother, Rachel, her lawyer, and now Daniel. They had each played a role in helping her rebuild her life, but she knew the most significant transformation had come from within. She had faced her fears, embraced her imperfections, and chosen to prioritize her happiness. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Jessica felt a sense of peace that she hadn't known in years. Her story was no longer defined by loss, but by the strength she had found in herself. Thomas's fall from grace had left him a broken man, but over time, he began to rebuild his life in small, humble steps. Taking a job as a laborer in a construction company, he found himself performing menial tasks that were a far cry from the luxurious lifestyle he once enjoyed. The physical labor was grueling, and the pay barely enough to cover his basic needs, but it offered him something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. For the first time, Thomas understood the value of honest work. Though his life was hard, Thomas found moments of clarity amidst the struggle. He began to reflect on the choices that had led to his downfall, acknowledging the pain he had caused Jessica and others. Regret gnawed at him, but it also fueled a desire to change. While he knew he could never undo the harm he had done, he resolved to live the rest of his life with integrity. Thomas's journey toward redemption was far from easy, but it was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Years after her ordeal, Jessica returned to her childhood home with Daniel by her side. The house, nestled among rolling fields and shaded by towering oaks, felt like a place of solace and renewal. As they walked through the familiar rooms, memories flooded Jessica's mind, some painful, others joyful. She showed Daniel the small bedroom where she had dreamed of a future filled with love and success, and the kitchen where she had watched her mother prepare meals with care and laughter. Standing in the backyard, Jessica felt a sense of closure. Her journey had come full circle, bringing her back to the place where her story had begun. She realized that her life was not defined by the betrayals she had endured or the challenges she had faced, but by the strength she had found in herself and the love she had built with Daniel. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jessica took Daniel's hand and smiled. She was no longer the woman who had been shattered by betrayal. She was a woman who had rebuilt herself, stronger and more radiant than ever before. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much for watching.